Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Story 1. Whispers in the Tomb, the Coffin Texts, and the Democratization of the Afterlife in Middle Kingdom Egypt. In the stillness of a rock-cut tomb nestled in the necropolis of Deir el-Bershah, a modest wooden coffin rests in silence. The body it once carried has long since decomposed, but its surface speaks. Painted in bold black hieroglyphs, etched with protective spells, and adorned with symbolic artistry, this coffin holds one of ancient Egypt's quiet revolutions. It is not a grand sarcophagus of a royal. It is the final resting place of a middle-tier official. Yet it dares to carry sacred words once reserved only for kings, the coffin texts. When you think of Egyptian mortuary traditions, perhaps you think of golden burial masks and grand pyramids. But by the Middle Kingdom period, circa 2055–1650 BCE, a subtle transformation was underway. The afterlife, the realm of Osiris, the god of the dead, was no longer the exclusive domain of pharaohs. A broader swath of Egyptian society began inscribing funerary spells and incantations on their coffins, ensuring their place among the blessed dead. In these boxes of wood and ink, the boundaries of spiritual privilege began to blur. The coffin texts, as they came to be known by modern Egyptologists, are a collection of over 1,000 spells and utterances. Many were inherited from the earlier pyramid texts, royal inscriptions carved into the walls of burial chambers in the Old Kingdom. But now, written on humble wooden coffins, these texts took on new life. Officials, priests, and provincial governors commissioned their own versions, tailored to their regional dialects and specific hopes for the afterlife. The transformation was not abrupt. It was, like much in Egyptian history, slow, layered, and steeped in religious conservatism. Ancient Egyptian religion did not progress in our modern sense. Instead, it accumulated, accreted, repeated. This made the democratization of the afterlife all the more remarkable. Why did a bureaucrat in a Siut dare to place on his coffin the same incantations once reserved for divine kingship? The answer lies in the crumbling of central authority. Following the collapse of the Old Kingdom, Egypt entered the First Intermediate Period, a time of fragmentation and local autonomy. Without a strong central pharaoh to dominate religious thought, local elites stepped into the vacuum. Temples still functioned and scribes still copied sacred texts. But now, they wrote not just for the king, but for anyone with the means to pay. The result was profound. Where once the journey to the afterlife was imagined as a celestial voyage reserved for the sun-born pharaoh, now it became a struggle against chaos accessible to all who could learn the words. The underworld was no longer a serene field. It was a perilous space of serpents, demons, and riddles. Only knowledge preserved in the ink of the coffin texts could save the soul. It is easy to overlook these texts because they are, at times, repetitive and dry. Spell 472, to become a falcon. Spell 535, to prevent the soul from being cut off. Spell 777, to repel a crocodile that comes to eat the heart. These are not poetic works. They are functional prayers, passwords, spells, and charms meant not for earthly ears but for divine gates. One striking difference from earlier texts is the shift in emphasis. The pyramid texts focus largely on the king ascending to the heavens, joining the sun god Ra. The coffin texts center instead on the domain of Osiris, a chthonic god, ruler of the Jew at the Egyptian underworld. Death is now a descent, not an ascent, and it is filled with judgment. One's actions in life, particularly toward others, begin to matter more. Ethics, however nascent, creep into the calculus of eternity. Even more curiously, the texts begin to include the idea of confession. The soul must deny wrongdoing in order to pass through certain gates. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not spoken falsely. These are the seeds of what will later become the famous negative confession in the Book of the Dead. Already, we can see a moral undercurrent rising, an idea that life matters, that death is not only a transition but a trial. Still, one wonders, how did the average Egyptian who could not read engage with these texts? Most were illiterate, yet they paid handsomely for scribes to inscribe these spells. The belief was not in understanding but in possession. The coffin became a vessel of divine technology. Like a sealed device loaded with incantations, it simply had to function correctly. The right words in the right order, regardless of comprehension, would carry the soul forward. The inscriptions are often chaotic, spells crammed into limited space, written vertically or diagonally, sometimes upside down. There was no standardized order. Each coffin is a personal theology. The result is a remarkable patchwork of hopes, fears, and beliefs. And in their very disorder, they tell us that the afterlife was not a fixed concept. It was negotiated, reimagined, and deeply personal. Consider the so-called heretical spells, those that diverge from established formulas or that introduce new mythological interpretations. In one coffin, a deceased individual claims direct kinship with the gods. In another, the underworld is described in spatial terms like a labyrinth of caverns. In yet another, the soul pleads not with Osiris but with obscure deities lost to us today. These were not copy-paste jobs. They were living texts, reflective of regional cults, family lineages, and individual desires. And still, through all this, we must imagine the physicality of it. The smell of cedar resin on the wood, the dull gleam of black ink applied with a reed brush, the careful work of artisans crafting not just coffins but vessels of eternity. This was not art for beauty's sake. It was survival, a spiritual toolkit meant to outlast the body, the family, even the kingdom. So what changed? Why did these middle-class Egyptians begin to believe they could share in a king's afterlife? Was it a matter of wealth now more widely available? Was it theology evolving to include more compassionate gods? Or was it, more simply, the oldest human instinct of all, the refusal to believe that death ends the story? When the Egyptian elite of the Middle Kingdom began adorning their coffins with sacred spells, they were not just preparing for death, they were claiming a spiritual geography. The afterlife, as envisioned in the coffin texts, was not an abstract paradise. It was a landscape, and like any landscape, it could be traversed, mapped, defended, and even politicized. The geography of the Jew at the Egyptian underworld was one of complexity and uncertainty. It was often imagined as a mirror world, running parallel to the land of the living. There were rivers to cross, doors to unlock, guardians to appease, and perils to avoid. The journey of the soul was arduous, not leisurely. Unlike the Christian heaven's singular destination of beatific rest, the Egyptian afterlife resembled a bureaucratic ordeal. You needed paperwork. You needed the correct incantations. You needed divine connections. This belief gave rise to a literalization of cosmic travel. Spells were often formulaic in structure but detailed in purpose. One might be for navigating a lake of fire, another for transforming into a bird to fly over danger, another for repelling a demon that measured one's breath. In spell 335, the deceased calls out, "O you who guard the secret ways, may I not be turned back from the gates." The gates were metaphysical. Yes, but in the Egyptian mind, they were just as real as the gate to the village granary. Unlike earlier pyramid-based theology, where the king joined the sun god Ra in the sky, the coffin texts shift the focus toward the Osirian afterlife, a subterranean domain governed by judgment, agriculture, and resurrection. Osiris, himself once a mortal king according to myth, had died and been reborn as ruler of the dead. His kingdom reflected earthly concerns: tilling, planting, flooding. In the afterlife, a just soul could expect to continue tending fields and enjoying seasonal abundance. Injustice, however, meant chaos, wandering, hunger, annihilation. And yet, even the idea of judgment was unevenly applied. While later texts like the Book of the Dead offer vivid scenes of the weighing of the heart, the coffin texts hint at these processes in fragmentary terms. Some spells prepare the soul for declaration. I have not seized the bread of the orphan. Others offer protective transformation. I become a swallow who escapes all snares. The soul might become light, air, a god, a lotus forms which ensured passage through hostile territory. This multiplicity of routes and outcomes reflects not confusion but adaptation. Each coffin becomes a personal GPS through eternity, tailored to the perceived risks of spiritual geography. There is no one way to the afterlife in these texts. Some souls plead for Osiris's mercy. Others rely on magical transformation. Some rely on knowledge alone. That knowledge was tightly controlled. Scribes, often temple-educated and trained in ritual protocols, had access to older funerary literature and were tasked with adapting them to new clients. The act of commissioning one's coffin texts was both religious and political. It declared the deceased as spiritually literate, or at least wealthy enough to outsource literacy. These texts, full of spells and utterances, were also status symbols. And so the politics of the afterlife mirrored those of life. A governor in Middle Egypt might not sit on a pharaoh's throne, but he could at least claim access to a royal soul's destiny. This was revolutionary. Ancient Egyptian society was famously hierarchical, stratified by divine kingship and priestly castes. Yet here, in the dark silence of tombs, local elites staged a spiritual uprising, writing themselves into a world once denied to them. But what did this mean for ordinary people? Most Egyptians could not afford such elaborate coffins. The democratization of the afterlife was, in practice, a democratization only for the middle and upper middle classes. The truly poor were buried in reed mats or pits, perhaps with a single amulet or token. The coffin texts did not reach them. And yet, the very existence of these texts hints at a shift in cultural imagination. Death was no longer a quiet vanishing or a privilege of kings. It became something one could prepare for, navigate, perhaps even master. A well-stocked coffin was like an afterlife passport, stamped with sacred ink and blessed by the wisdom of scribes. Some spells reflect desperation as much as faith. In spell 136, the deceased cries, "Do not let me be hungry in the realm of the dead." In others, they ask not to be mutilated, not to be forgotten, not to wander alone. The fear of oblivion loomed large. The afterlife was not simply about joy. It was about continuity, being remembered, being nourished, being real. We must imagine how personal this process was. A man approaching death might sit with a scribe and dictate what he feared, what he hoped for, what gods he wished to call upon. The result would not be a standard text but a mosaic of anxieties, loyalties, and dreams. Some chose to emphasize resurrection, others defense. Some leaned on local deities unknown to the court in Thebes. Interestingly, women also appear more frequently in these texts than in earlier funerary literature. Female names, female prayers, and even goddesses as protectors begin to proliferate. Was this evidence of shifting gender roles in theology, or a reflection of growing personalization in belief? One spell describes the deceased woman as a daughter of Osiris, entitled to join him in peace. The afterlife, it seems, was becoming not just broader but more inclusive. And through it all, the wood, always the wood. Unlike stone, which endured, wood decayed, but it also spread. Coffins were portable, movable, affordable compared to massive sarcophagi. This allowed the spread of ideas, the diffusion of regional beliefs, and the subtle mutiny against centralized ritual orthodoxy. Coffins became books, books became maps, and maps became acts of resistance. In tombs scattered across the Nile Valley, these wooden boxes whisper still. Their words are worn, their ink faded, but their message remains. Death is no longer the end. It is a journey, and every journey needs a guide. Still, one wonders what happens when too many maps exist. When everyone has their own afterlife, their own spells, their own truths. Could the afterlife become too accessible, too plural, too contradictory? By the later centuries of the Middle Kingdom, the wooden coffins bearing the spells of the dead had become vessels not only for the preservation of a body, but for the assertion of a new spiritual order. These humble boxes stained with resin, bandaged with linen, inked with borrowed divinity were more than funerary artifacts. They were testimonies of personal survival strategies in a cosmically uncertain world. As the reach of the coffin texts expanded, so did the complexity of Egyptian theology. Where once death had been the domain of the royal soul ascending with Ra in solar splendor, it had become something earthier, riskier, and paradoxically more relatable. Osiris, the god whose dismembered body had been lovingly reassembled by his sister wife Isis, rose as the dominant figure of hope. The metaphor was intimate. Just as Osiris was pieced together, so too could any soul be restored. The idea of death as dismemberment, spiritual, social, and literal, reflected the Middle Kingdom's persistent insecurity. Periodic droughts, Nubian incursions, political decentralization, and the lingering trauma of the First Intermediate Period all loomed large. To survive was a feat, to thrive in death, a miracle. It is no wonder that a theology of reconstruction took hold. The coffin texts do not always offer comfort. They are anxious, practical, sometimes even desperate. Spell 532 warns the soul against becoming one who cannot speak. To lose one's voice was to lose one's agency in the afterlife, an unthinkable fate. Many spells thus focus on protecting the Ba, the personality or soul force, from separation or paralysis. Some even include instructions for reuniting the limbs, ensuring the deceased would be whole and recognizable. Death was not peaceful, it was contested. Demons, snakes, fire, and darkness haunted the path to paradise. And yet, for all the terror, there was a promise buried in the texts: knowledge protects. The written word, recited or simply present, became a shield. Even in the afterlife, the Egyptians believed that understanding the rules could shape one's destiny. But even within this structure, something remarkable occurred. The texts began to shift toward interiority. Where older funerary texts had focused on cosmic order and royal destiny, the coffin texts began to hint at emotional life. Spells express weariness, fear, longing. The soul says, "I am tired of roaming." Another asks, "May I see my house once more?" These are not the pronouncements of gods, they are the prayers of people. And this personalization paved the way for something revolutionary: ethics. For perhaps the first time in Egyptian religion, morality began to play a clearer role in the fate of the soul. While still embryonic in the coffin texts, ideas of judgment, confession, and divine justice were taking root. Osiris was not merely a gatekeeper, he was a judge. And one's conduct in life, though always important socially, now began to matter theologically. This evolution would later be codified in the negative confession of the Book of the Dead, where the soul denies a litany of sins before the 42 assessors of man. But its seeds were already germinating in the coffin texts. The soul must be clean, truthful, modest, respectful of others. Not perfectly so, but enough to pass the gates. The concept of Ma'at order, justice, truth, was no longer the Pharaoh's cosmic burden alone. It was everyone's concern. The democratization of the afterlife was accompanied by a democratization of accountability. You could seek eternity, but you had to earn it. It's important to pause and consider the practical implications of this shift. Tomb construction, coffin design, spell selection, these became industries. Scribes and artisans flourished. Workshops emerged that specialized in funerary preparation. Regional variations developed, with southern and northern Egypt adapting the spells to local customs and dialects. Even family lineages began to standardize their burial texts, creating private traditions within a national religious framework. In this way, the coffin texts also become a record of community memory. A son might be buried with similar spells to his father, a governor with the same protections as his predecessor. Death became a genealogical project, a weaving of ancestry and aspiration. Yet it wasn't static. Certain spells were updated, others dropped. Some introduced new deities, regional gods, abstract forces, even personified organs. The texts became a theological sandbox where scribes experimented with formulas, metaphors, and mythologies. There was no centralized priesthood enforcing orthodoxy. Each coffin was a quiet act of theological authorship. This tension between tradition and innovation, orthodoxy and experimentation, is what makes the coffin texts so compelling. They are at once derivative and creative. They copy, but they do not conform. In this way, they reflect the broader Egyptian relationship with time, not linear but cyclical. The past was always present but always slightly reshaped. And through it all, Osiris endures. The god whose death gave meaning to human mortality remains the axis around which these texts turn. In some spells, he is a serene judge. In others, a vengeful deity. Sometimes he is silent, but always he is there, the first to die, the first to return, the promise that death can be undone. Eventually, the coffin texts would evolve into the Book of the Dead, which appeared in the New Kingdom. These newer texts would be written on papyrus scrolls, not on coffins, and they would reflect more formalized theology. But the shift had already occurred. The soul's journey was now a matter of individual preparation, not royal entitlement. What then is the legacy of the coffin texts? It lies not in grand monuments or golden treasures, but in their quiet insistence that every person, not just kings, mattered in death. That survival was not about power but preparation. That the soul's journey, fraught, frightening, and uncertain, was worth documenting, protecting, and imagining. These coffin-side prayers are, in a way, ancient manuals of hope. They do not promise glory or splendor. They promise a path, a possibility. In their fatting hieroglyphs, scratched into drying wood by tired hands, we can still hear a voice whisper, "Let me pass, let me speak, let me not die again." And it makes us wonder, in a world where so many paths to the afterlife existed, each coffin with its own map, its own logic, did the Egyptians ever ask, "What if I've chosen the wrong one?" Story 2. City of the Dead, the necropolis of Saqqara and the economics of eternal life. You stand on the desert plateau, just beyond the curve of the cultivated Nile Valley. The sun is high, the dust is warm and still, and before you stretches a landscape not of the living, but of the dead. Tombs of every shape, size, and social rank scatter the horizon. Some are little more than sand-covered pits. Others are elaborate mastabas, flat-roofed rectangular tombs with underground burial chambers and decorated chapels. In the distance looms a familiar step-shaped structure, the Pyramid of Djoser, oldest of its kind. This is Saqqara, Egypt's first great necropolis, and for over 3,000 years it was the place to go if you wanted to live forever. Though it may not look like it, Saqqara was once one of the busiest construction zones in the ancient world. It was more than a cemetery, it was a city of stone, a hub of religious experimentation, labor, economic planning, and social performance. A place where the dead worked through monuments, where money was spent to manipulate memory, and where the ancient Egyptian obsession with eternity found its most stable home. But the Saqqara you see today is not the Saqqara most Egyptians saw in their lifetimes. For most, the inner workings of its tomb complexes and the labyrinthine chapels of priests and scribes remained a mystery. Saqqara's surface may have belonged to kings, but its foundations were carved out by thousands of anonymous hands, masons, craftsmen, quarry workers, and scribes who turned limestone, mud brick, and pigment into vehicles of immortality. It all began with Djoser, the first king of Egypt's third dynasty, c. 2670 BCE. His architect, Imhotep, designed the step pyramid, arguably Egypt's first major stone building and an audacious departure from earlier mud brick tombs. It wasn't just bigger, it was a bold experiment in permanence. Whereas earlier tombs might collapse, this one sought to endure, to defy weather and time and the erosion of memory. Djozir's complex included temples, chapels, courtyards, and ceremonial halls. But the real genius of Saqqara was logistical. Every part of the pyramid complex worked like a spiritual machine. Priests would perform daily rites in the king's name, offering food, incense, and praise. These were not just gestures, they were payments, feeding the king's soul, keeping him alive in the afterlife through ritual economy. And that economy was vast. By the time of the 5th and 6th dynasties, the necropolis had become a sprawling institution. High officials, scribes, and even minor elites began to build their own tombs within sight of the king's pyramid, hoping to ride his coattails into eternity. They paid dearly for the privilege. A typical tomb required not only construction but ongoing maintenance. The deceased needed food offerings, libations, and commemorations, what the Egyptians called Letter-125 or an offering that the king gives. Since the king wasn't likely to show up, these duties were delegated to priests, many of whom were family members or paid caretakers. A well-connected individual might establish an endowment, a portion of land or goods that funded his posthumous ritual care. Think of it as a trust fund for the dead. Land produced grain, grain funded priests, priests fed the soul. The tomb worked so long as the system did. But this created an interesting problem. The poor could die, but could they afford eternity? By the Middle Kingdom, the answer had become, perhaps if you planned carefully. The rise of smaller tombs, more affordable funerary goods, and mass-produced items like Shabti figurines, magical servants for the afterlife, meant that even non-elites could partake in some form of ritual survival. But access to Saqqara remained largely limited to the well-to-do. This exclusivity created a curious paradox. The city of the dead mirrored the city of the living in its class divisions. The best plots were closest to the king's tomb. More elaborate scenes, banquets, hunting, music meant more status. And while many scenes were symbolic, they reflected real economic concerns, showcasing not only what you hoped for in the afterlife, but what you had in life. Tomb inscriptions often list titles in exhausting detail: scribe of the granary, overseer of cattle, controller of the 2 harbors. These titles weren't just resume padding. They were statements of power. Titles meant income. Income meant offerings. Offerings meant eternity. Still, no amount of wealth could prevent change. By the end of the Old Kingdom, many of these endowments collapsed. The centralized state weakened. Priests defaulted on their duties. Offerings ceased. Tombs were neglected. Some were even robbed or repurposed. Without upkeep, the mechanisms of eternity stalled. Yet the dream persisted. New families returned to Saqqara in later centuries during the New Kingdom, the Late Period, and even under the Greeks and Romans. They built over old tombs, inscribed new prayers, adapted old gods. In time, Saqqara became a palimpsest, a cemetery written and rewritten across millennia. And that layering is part of its strange charm. In one tomb you may find a pharaonic priest. In another, a Greek-speaking Egyptian official. Further along, a Coptic Christian monk. The sacredness of the place endured long after the original meanings of its rituals faded. We tend to think of ancient Egyptian religion as static, monolithic. But Saqqara reminds us that nothing, not even death, stands still. Take, for example, the tomb of Mereruka, a high official under King Teti, c. 2323 BCE. His tomb is vast, 32 rooms, richly decorated with scenes of fishing, furniture making, family gatherings, and scribes at work. The effect is one of abundance and activity. This was no quiet afterlife, it was a continuation of bureaucracy, of personal status, of elite identity. Even in death, Mereruka expected to manage others. But one wonders, did he? Did the priests keep coming? Did the offerings arrive? Or did his name slowly fade beneath layers of sand and other people's dreams? Saqqara is filled with such questions. The stories etched into its walls are confident, declarative. I have not sinned. I will live forever. My Ka will be satisfied. But the silence of the necropolis suggests something else. a kind of anxious hopefulness, a desire to control that which can never be controlled. Still, the stones remain. Thousands of years later, we walk these dusty corridors, reading the names, decoding the scenes, puzzled by the same mysteries. What does it mean to die? What must one do to be remembered? And most of all, can eternity be bought, or only hoped for? Saqqara may appear today as a crumbling field of stones and sand, but in the Middle and New Kingdoms it was not a place of stillness. It was alive with activity. Masons chiseling limestone, painters grinding ochre, scribes checking over contracts, priests chanting offerings, families inspecting the progress of a loved one's eternal home. In its time, Saqqara was not a place of peace but of preparation. A tomb was not simply a structure to house a body. It was a machine with moving parts, legal, spiritual, economic. Its operation began long before death and often continued decades, sometimes centuries after. And like any good machine, it needed maintenance, funding, and protection. This gives us a strange but very real insight into ancient Egyptian notions of death. For them, the afterlife wasn't a spontaneous ascension or a final resting place. It was work, and that work required infrastructure. The key to this infrastructure was the cult of the dead, a term modern scholars use to describe the daily and seasonal rituals performed in tombs to sustain the deceased's ka, or life force. These rituals included libations, food offerings, burning of incense, recitation of spells, and often full reenactments of important festivals such as the Feast of the Valley, when the living visited tombs to commune with their dead. These rituals didn't happen on their own. They were performed by paid staff, either family members, employees, or professional mortuary priests. Larger tombs often included designated rooms and niches for these rituals, with false doors carved to symbolically allow the soul to receive the offerings. The food was real. The wine, if the family could afford it, was poured. It was, in short, a contract. The dead supplied memory, the living supplied sustenance. To ensure this continuity, many tomb owners established endowments. These were formalized land grants, recorded in tomb inscriptions or on stelae, setting aside portions of harvest or income to fund funerary rites in perpetuity. Some even listed specific workers or shares of cattle, grain, or fish from the Nile. An example, a nobleman named Ankh-Tifi from the First Intermediate Period arranged for a share of barley from his estates to be delivered to his tomb every harvest, funding offerings for himself and his wife. His inscriptions read less like prayer and more like contractual obligations. "Should this not be done," he writes, "my ka will not rest and the gods will not forgive the wrongdoer." Tombs, then, were legal instruments as much as spiritual ones. They expressed a binding agreement between the deceased and their descendants. If the agreement was honored, the dead lived on. If not, their ka suffered. This tension between remembrance and forgetting, between continuity and abandonment, was the emotional core of Saqqara. This helps explain why so many tomb inscriptions are obsessed with legacy. The phrase, "May my name endure," appears again and again. More than material wealth, more than ornamentation, the goal was to be remembered. In a culture without resurrection in the Christian sense, memory was immortality. A name spoken was a soul fed. But what happens when memory fails? This brings us to the fascinating practice of tomb usurpation. In later periods, especially during political instability or economic decline, older tombs at Saqqara were often recycled. A new owner might chisel out the name of the previous occupant, replacing it with their own. Sometimes, they would preserve earlier texts but alter the names and titles. Other times, they would erase all trace of the former soul. This wasn't seen as criminal, it was often seen as practical, and even justified. To the Egyptians, names were power. A person whose name was erased was at risk of second death, the complete annihilation of the soul, the worst possible fate. This practice wasn't limited to anonymous elites. Even royals faced this peril. Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who promoted the worship of the sun disk Aten, had his name struck from monuments across Egypt after his death. statues smashed, reliefs defaced. It was a spiritual execution through memory, and it reveals just how fragile eternity could be. Back at Saqqara, we see this anxiety in the tomb inscriptions themselves. Many include curses against trespassers or thieves. As for any man who enters this tomb and does harm, may the crocodile seize him. May his name not endure. May he not receive offerings in the realm of the dead. Others go further, appealing directly to the reader. O you who live upon the earth, who pass by this tomb, speak my name and pour out water for me. Then your own soul shall flourish. It is a transaction. Speak my name, and I will reward you in kind. Even strangers could sustain the dead. And yet, despite all this effort, elaborate construction, legal arrangements, priestly employment, the survival of one's tomb ultimately depended on the forces of time, climate, and politics. Sand buried monuments, dynasties rose and fell, invasions came and went, cults were suppressed, beliefs changed. But this only made the Egyptians double down. By the New Kingdom, burial practices at Saqqara adapted again. Tombs became more compact, often with subterranean chambers. Walls were painted with vivid scenes: fishing, banqueting, harvesting, music, all activities the deceased hoped to continue in the afterlife. The social performance of wealth became internalized. Even if public rituals faded, the painted ritual would endure inside the sealed tomb. It was an insurance policy of sorts. If priests forgot, the images would not. If family failed, the inscriptions would persist. If no offerings came, the symbolic ones would suffice. Interestingly, even the offerings became standardized. Clay offering trays, fake bread loaves, and painted images of food became common. The idea was that representation itself could carry metaphysical weight. Symbols stood in for substance. This reliance on symbol created a fascinating blend of literalism and abstraction. On the one hand, Egyptians believed in a physically real afterlife, with food, labor, danger, and joy. On the other, they increasingly used representations to stand in for that reality. Images of servant Shabtis were expected to rise and work on the deceased's behalf. Depictions of cattle were believed to produce milk and meat. The spiritual economy became one of tokens and proxies. But still, the anxiety persisted. We find it in tomb graffiti left by later visitors. In one tomb, a Greek inscription from centuries after the original burial reads, "Good man, rest in peace." It's a small, quiet gesture. A stranger, not knowing the dead, speaks his name and offers a blessing. Perhaps unknowingly, they fulfill the tomb's request to be remembered, even in translation, even imperfectly. Saqqara reminds us that death for the Egyptians was never final, but it was also never simple. It had to be managed, sustained, fed, and protected. Memory was currency. Labor was eternal. Contracts did not end with breath. Still, one wonders what of those whose tombs have not yet been found, whose names were never inscribed. Did their souls find sustenance in silence? Beneath the grandeur of Saqqara's painted chapels and stone facades, another story lies, one without reliefs, without inscriptions, without gold or titles. It is the story of the invisible poor. The thousands who died without monuments, who were buried on the periphery, who left behind no Shabtis or endowments, and whose names were never recorded. And yet, they too came to Saqqara. While the elite tombs claim our attention with their vivid imagery and hieroglyphic boasts, the vast majority of ancient Egyptians, over 90% of the population, left behind no such record. Their tombs, if one can call them that, were shallow pits, wrapped in modest linen, sometimes accompanied by a simple jar or amulet. In the margins of the necropolis, their bodies rest in silence. Archaeologically, these modest burials are more difficult to preserve, more easily erased by time. And yet they are essential to understanding Saqqara not as a museum of kings, but as a cross-section of a society reckoning with mortality. These unadorned burials raise important questions. Did the poor believe in the same afterlife as the elites? Did they fear the underworld's serpents and guardians? Did they recite the same coffin texts and Book of the Dead spells, or did they rely on other means? The evidence is fragmentary but illuminating. Many poorer tombs contain small tokens, scarabs, amulets, miniature stelae with painted eyes or names, and crude figurines shaped from unfired clay. Some bodies were buried with protective symbols drawn directly onto linen wrappings. Others were positioned carefully, hands crossed over chests, faces turned toward the rising sun, hints of belief, if not literacy. In some cases, fragments of funerary texts have been found reused on scraps of wood or linen, suggesting that even among the poor, there was a desire to possess the protective words of the afterlife. These were not formally commissioned spells, but inherited, salvaged, or copied by hand, a kind of spiritual bootstrapping. And while the poor may not have had priests to maintain their cults, they often relied on family. Oral traditions, seasonal visits to burial grounds, offerings left in pottery jars all served as acts of remembrance. In a society where literacy was limited, memory could still be kept in ritual. The act of visiting a loved one's grave during the Feast of the Valley was an act of service, a bridge between the worlds. Still, the limitations were stark. Without endowments, rituals faded quickly. Without names, souls were at risk of being forgotten. And in a theological system where name, voice, and memory were essential for survival, the poor faced a harsher metaphysical reality. This divide between the eternally remembered and the quietly lost is one of Saqqara's deepest legacies. It reveals not only the structure of ancient Egyptian society, but the existential weight that structure carried into the afterlife. Eternity, in effect, was stratified. And yet, even in this imbalance, there are unexpected moments of unity. Consider the reuse of tombs. In later periods, the tombs of the elite were often repurposed by those with fewer resources. A wealthy 5th dynasty official's chapel might be adapted by a family from the 22nd dynasty, carving in new names, leaving new offerings. In doing so, they layered their presence atop another's dream. In a strange way, they shared eternity. There's also the persistence of ritual forms across class lines. The structure of the offering formula letter 1E25TPDNSW appears in both grand tombs and modest stelae. The desire to receive bread, beer, oxen, and fowl in the afterlife was universal. What differed was the scale. One might have painted scenes of banquets, another a single clay loaf, but the longing was the same. In later periods, especially under the Ptolemies and early Roman occupation, the boundaries softened further. Greek-style burials began appearing alongside traditional Egyptian ones. Names changed. Deities hybridized. Tombs incorporated both Greek and Egyptian iconography. Saqqara became, once again, a living city of the dead, a place where beliefs merged, where customs adapted. And yet, throughout all these changes, the core remained. A deep, culturally shared belief in the power of the dead. The dead were not passive. They could influence the world of the living. Letters to the dead found at Saqqara and other sites plead for help, with illness, with fertility, with justice. One woman, writing to her deceased husband, accuses his second wife of theft and begs him to intervene. "See what she has done to your house," the letter reads, "and do not let her triumph." Tombs were not mausoleums. They were courtrooms, temples, memory theaters. They had agency, legal, spiritual, emotional. They were designed not only to protect the soul, but to project it. And so we must return to the idea of the tomb as machine. Each one, whether grand or modest, was built to function. Through inscription, offering, and ritual, it sustained the soul and extended its power. But like all machines, it could fail. When the offering stopped, when the name faded, when the stone cracked, what then? We know that Egyptians feared second death more than anything. To be forgotten, to be erased. This was the true horror, but Saqqara resists that fate. Through archaeology, through scholarship, through the very act of remembering, we revive these names. A tomb once sealed for 3,000 years is opened. Light touches a painted face. A scribe's name is read aloud again, and for a moment in that breath the soul stirs. This is the final irony. The city of the dead is not dead. It endures through its rediscovery, through our curiosity. The rituals may have ceased, but the memory continues shifted, distorted, but alive. As you stand among the ruined mastabas, feeling the heat radiate from the stones, listening to the silent wind push through the columns, one question lingers. If eternity depends on being remembered, then who decides whose names are spoken? Story 3. Sheol Silence, Ancient Hebrew Beliefs Before Heaven. You might be surprised to learn that for most of ancient Israelite history, there was no heaven in the modern sense. No fiery hell, no pearly gates, no reward for the righteous, no eternal punishment for the wicked, just Sheol. Sheol, mentioned dozens of times in the Hebrew Bible, was not paradise nor torment. It was silence, darkness, dust, a place of shadows, a place where everyone went, the good, the wicked, the powerful, the poor. It was not a moral sorting ground, but rather a neutral, inevitable destination. To understand Sheol, we must return to a world before heaven and hell, before the dualistic moral economies of later Judaism and Christianity. We must go back to the ancient Near East, where the Hebrew people lived among and in dialogue with cultures like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Canaan. Each had their own visions of the afterlife, some elaborate, others grim. The Israelites, for much of their early existence, chose silence. In the book of Genesis, when Jacob is told that his son Joseph has died, he mourns and declares, "I will go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Genesis 37:35. This is not a statement of hope for reunion in a glorious afterlife. It is a resignation, a descent. Sheol is the destination of grief, not joy. In 1 Samuel, King Saul, desperate for guidance, seeks out the witch of Endor to raise the spirit of the prophet Samuel from the dead. The result is eerie. Samuel appears from the ground, disoriented, irritated. He speaks not from a celestial throne, but from below. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" 1 Samuel 28:15. This vision captures the essence of Sheol. It is down. It is shadowed, and the dead are not at peace so much as asleep, removed, unreachable. But what was Sheol really? In the Hebrew imagination, Sheol was a subterranean realm beneath the earth. It was not hell in the Christian sense, for it was not associated with punishment, nor was it a reward for the faithful. It was simply where the dead went. Job, perhaps the most existential of all biblical figures, describes it as a land of gloom and deep shadow, where light is as darkness. Job 10:21-22. It is a poetic rendering of oblivion. There is no worship there, no knowledge, the Psalms declare. The dead do not praise the Lord, nor do any who go down into silence. Psalm 115:17. This absence of divine interaction in Sheol deeply shaped early Hebrew theology. Unlike Egyptian or Mesopotamian afterlives, where souls could be judged, transformed, or rewarded, the ancient Israelites placed their religious hope in life, not in death. God's promises, blessing, land, descendants, justice were expected to occur now. To obey was to live well, to disobey was to suffer. But when one died, even the most righteous met the same fate as the sinner. This belief had practical consequences. Mortality loomed large. There was no cosmic safety net. That's why blessings of long life, many children, and peaceful death were so emphasized in the Torah. They were the only guarantees of reward. Eternity was not spiritual, it was genealogical. But this does not mean the Israelites were without hope or complexity. The book of Ecclesiastes, that famously skeptical text, confronts the futility of earthly life and the uncertainty of death. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no further reward, even their memory is forgotten. Ecclesiastes 9:5. And yet Ecclesiastes also encourages joy. Eat, drink, find satisfaction in your labor. This was not hedonism but realism. With Sheol as the ultimate end, life mattered all the more. Still, over time, cracks began to appear in this framework. What happens when the righteous suffer, when the wicked prosper? If there is no reward beyond the grave, how can divine justice hold? These were not theoretical questions. Israel's history was filled with trauma, exile, conquest, oppression. The Babylonian destruction of the temple in 586 BCE especially shook theological confidence. The people of God had not been protected. Innocents had perished. What then? In the aftermath, prophetic and poetic voices began to shift. New ideas arose. Daniel, one of the latest books of the Hebrew Bible, speaks cryptically of resurrection. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Daniel 12:2. This is a radical departure from earlier texts. For the first time, death is not final. Sheol is no longer the only destination. The soul can awaken, and it can face judgment. But we must not leap ahead too quickly. In much of the Hebrew Bible, Sheol remains, the quiet pit, the house of meeting, a realm untouched by divine intervention. Some scholars have suggested that Sheol may reflect a deliberate theological stance. Unlike neighboring religions which offered detailed maps of the afterlife, the Israelites maintained a cautious ambiguity. It wasn't ignorance, it was emphasis. Focus on this life. Serve God now. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly, because once you are in Sheol, there is no second chance. Others see Sheol as a residual cultural inheritance, an echo of Canaanite or Mesopotamian beliefs slowly refined over centuries. In Ugaritic myth, for instance, the underworld is ruled by the god Mo, a being of death and chaos. The biblical Sheol is less personified but similarly implacable. What we know for certain is that Sheol was not feared like hell, nor desired like heaven. It was accepted. It was the great equalizer. The poet of Psalm 88 laments, "I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more." This is not rebellion against God but heartbreak at divine absence, and it captures the emotional core of early Hebrew eschatology, not fear of torture, not hope of bliss, but sorrow at separation, a yearning to remain within God's memory. Sheol, then, was not merely a place. It was a concept, an existential horizon, a statement of human limitation. And for a people deeply rooted in covenant, law, and communal history, the loss of name and memory in Sheol was perhaps the ultimate spiritual threat. Still, we might ask, if death was silence, how did the hope for something more begin to whisper? If the early Israelite worldview accepted Sheol as the inescapable end of all life, a realm of shadows and silence, then the later periods of Israel's story show us the beginnings of resistance to that silence. Something shifted. The dust did not settle. Slowly, haltingly, cracks appeared in the bleak stone of Sheol. Out of those cracks emerged new ideas: hope, judgment, even resurrection. But it did not happen all at once. Instead, the transformation of Israelite beliefs about death was gradual, layered, and importantly reactive. It emerged not from abstract theological musings, but from live trauma. The destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE, the exile in Babylon, the grinding oppression of foreign empires, these historical shocks shook the very foundation of the idea that God rewarded righteousness in this life. If the righteous suffered and died, and the wicked prospered and remained, what did that say about justice? Could God still be just? The book of Job, written perhaps during or shortly after the exile, becomes a turning point in this internal debate. Job is described as blameless, upright, and yet he is brought low physically, socially, emotionally. His children are killed. His body is afflicted. His name is slandered, and Sheol looms close. In Job's lowest moment, he cries, "Man lies down and does not rise. Until the heavens are no more, they will not awake nor be aroused from their sleep. Job 14:12. But later, in a glimmer of almost resurrectionist hope, he declares, I know that my Redeemer lives, and in the end he will stand on the earth. After my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. Job 19:25-26. The tension is unmistakable. Job shifts between resignation and yearning, between the certainty of Sheol and a fragile hope that God may not abandon him forever. This vacillation is the theological heartbeat of the Second Temple period, an unresolved struggle between tradition and emerging eschatology. During the exile and post-exilic period, roughly 6th-4th century BCE, Israel encountered and engaged with a broader world. The Persians brought Zoroastrianism, which emphasized cosmic dualism, good versus evil, heaven versus hell. Later, under the Seleucid Greeks, Hellenistic philosophy introduced the immortality of the soul as a rational concept. These ideas did not simply replace Hebrew theology, but they interacted with it, pressing upon it, stretching its frameworks. By the time of the late prophetic and apocalyptic writings, we begin to see the rise of resurrection as a formal theological hope. The clearest example comes from the book of Daniel, written c. 2nd century BCE, where the shift is almost jarring. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Daniel 12:2. Here, for the first time in the Hebrew canon, death is not the end. The soul is roused. Judgment awaits. Not all will be rewarded, but some will. The moral universe is reborn beyond the grave. But Daniel's vision is not individualistic. It is deeply national, born from persecution. Written during the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, when Jews were violently oppressed for their faith, Daniel offers a theology of hope beyond martyrdom. If you died for righteousness, you would not remain in Sheol. You would rise. This marked a theological revolution. Earlier, righteousness was expected to be rewarded in this life with children, land, long years. Now, for the first time, righteousness might cost you your life but earn you something better after. Sheol no longer had the final word. This concept was further expanded in the Book of Enoch, written in the 3rd-2nd centuries BCE, a wildly popular work among many Jewish communities, though ultimately excluded from the Hebrew Bible. Enoch describes a detailed landscape of the afterlife, with multiple compartments for the dead, the righteous, the wicked, the martyrs, the accursed. It is here that Sheol begins to fragment not one place but many. Judgment becomes personal. Souls await vindication. Meanwhile, the Wisdom of Solomon, likely composed in Alexandria under Hellenistic influence, speaks explicitly of the soul's immortality. The souls of the righteous are in the hand of God, and no torment will ever touch them. Wisdom 3:1. In the eyes of the foolish they seem to have died, but they are at peace. 3:2-3. This reflects an integration of Greek philosophical ideals with Jewish moral theology. Death no longer ends everything. It begins a process. And yet, even as these ideas take shape, the older view of Sheol persists in parallel. Psalm 49, likely composed in the post-exilic period, states, Like sheep they are destined for Sheol, death will be their shepherd, but God will redeem me from the realm of the dead, he will surely take me to himself. Psalm 49, 14-15. This reflects a transitional stage, a retention of Sheol as the general fate, with a new belief that God might rescue the righteous from it. Redemption becomes selective, not automatic. The tension within Jewish communities continued into the 1st century BCE and beyond, culminating in a variety of beliefs by the time of Jesus. The Pharisees believed in resurrection. The Sadducees did not. The Essenes, authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls, believed in reward and punishment after death. The Jewish world had become spiritually plural. And so, Sheol, once the universal destination, became contested ground. Yet its legacy remains important. Sheol shaped the emotional honesty of the Hebrew Bible. It gave voice to grief, to despair, to the uncertainty of mortality. It kept religion grounded in the here and now. Its silence made life more urgent. Even as resurrection theology blossomed, and even as the Christian heaven emerged from these roots, Sheol lingered. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, Sheol was rendered as Hades, another shift, this time into Greco-Roman frameworks. But Sheol was never about fire or punishment. It was about absence. Still, one wonders, did the ancient Israelites, as they laid their dead into the ground, whisper secret hopes that Sheol was not all there was? By the dawn of the 1st century CE, Jewish thought was a mosaic of afterlife ideas. The long reign of Sheol as the silent, neutral abode of the dead was giving way to a rich and varied eschatological imagination. Some held to the old view: the dead sleep in darkness, awaiting nothing. Others envisioned judgment, resurrection, and reward. The tension between these perspectives did not resolve, it expanded. And into that expanding landscape came a new voice. The early Christians, emerging from Jewish sectarian roots, did not discard Sheol entirely. Instead, they transformed it. In the New Testament, Sheol is translated as Hades, borrowing from Greek cosmology. But where Hades was often conceived as a shadowy realm of forgetfulness, the Gospels give it sharper contours. In Luke 16, Jesus tells the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man dies and goes to Hades, where he is tormented. Lazarus, a poor beggar, is carried to the bosom of Abraham. The scene is vivid, a chasm between reward and punishment, with awareness, speech, and regret. This is not Sheol, it is a morally sordid afterlife. And yet the roots are there. The descent, the shadow, the division between memory and silence, these are echoes of Sheol refracted through a new lens. The concept has not disappeared, it has evolved. The Apostles' Creed, a foundational Christian confession developed centuries later, includes the line, "He descended into hell." In the original context, this hell was not the inferno of medieval imagination, it was Sheol, or Hades, the realm of the dead. Jesus' descent was not to suffer, but to conquer. He entered the silence of Sheol and emerged victorious, bringing hope of resurrection not just for himself, but for all. This theological move was monumental. It reframed Sheol from a place of abandonment to a place that could be overcome. Meanwhile, in Rabbinic Judaism developing alongside early Christianity, the Sheol of the Hebrew Bible was gradually eclipsed by a new concept, Gehenna. This was a realm of purification or punishment after death, drawing on images of the Valley of Hinnom near Jerusalem, once associated with child sacrifice and desecration. Gehenna served as a moral contrast to the world to come, Olam Haba, a heavenly reward for the righteous. Though Gehenna would later be compared to hell, early rabbinic sources often presented it as temporary, a place where the soul was refined, not eternally damned. Sheol, in this context, faded into obscurity, replaced by more ethically charged destinations. But Sheol never fully vanished. In modern Jewish liturgy, echoes remain. The Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, never mentions the afterlife at all. It focuses instead on praising God, reaffirming life. This silence may be Sheol's final legacy, a theological modesty that refuses to define the unknowable. In literature and poetry, Sheol lives on as a metaphor for grief, isolation, and the quiet fear of being forgotten. In Psalm 139, the poet cries, "If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there." This line is profound. It marks a turning point. Even in the depths, even in silence, even in the grave, God is present. Sheol becomes not just a place of absence, but a place of divine reach. It's here that we begin to see the emotional maturity of this belief. Sheol, though originally grim and stark, offered something that later visions of judgment and punishment often lost: solidarity. All died, all descended. The rich, the poor, the righteous, the wicked. Sheol was brutally equal. In a way, it humanized theology. It grounded it in sorrow, and it forced faith to focus not on reward, but on relationship with God, with community, with the present moment. The move toward heaven and hell, resurrection and glory offered hope, yes, but also new anxieties. Was I righteous enough? Would I pass judgment? Would my soul rise? Sheol asked no such questions. It only reminded you that life was short and memory was fragile. And so we return to where we began, with dust, silence, and the need to be remembered. Ancient Israelites feared being cut off not from pleasure but from presence, not from divine favor but from the land of the living. Their songs, their rituals, their laws were oriented toward this life. And in a world where death was final, every act became sacred. Perhaps this is why Sheol still matters. In an age of promises, eternal bliss, eternal fire, crystal cities, and golden crowns, there is something hauntingly honest about Sheol. It admits what we often avoid, that we do not know, that the grave is dark, that death is silence, and that what we do here now matters all the more because of it. But the story of Sheol does not end in silence. Its echoes shape the Christian concept of resurrection, the Jewish hope of Olam Haba, and even Islamic visions of the grave. Out of Sheol's shadow grew theologies of light. Still, one question lingers, quiet as the grave. If eternity begins in silence, whose voice will be the first to break it? Story 4. The Elysian Fields and Roman Elegance in Death. To understand Roman beliefs about the afterlife, one must first understand how the Romans died, or more precisely, how they were buried. For in the world of the Republic and later the Empire, how you were remembered was often more important than what you believed happened to your soul. The afterlife was uncertain. Public memory, on the other hand, could be built with marble, bronze, and processions. Imagine the death of a Roman senator in the 2nd century BCE. His final moments were not merely private grief, they were a public affair. The family would gather. The wax death masks of ancestors would be brought out. A funeral procession would wind through the streets of Rome, featuring musicians, mourners, and actors impersonating dead relatives. These images, or ancestral portraits, were not just ceremonial, they were symbols of lineage, proof that the deceased belonged to a legacy worth remembering. This wasn't just theater. It was theology, politics, and sociology wrapped together. For the Romans of the Republic, there was no single official doctrine of the afterlife. Belief varied widely. The dead might live on in the manes, ancestral spirits venerated by families. They might join the Shades or Umbri in the underworld, a hazy realm ruled by Pluto. They might even ascend to the Elysian Fields, a paradise for heroes and the especially virtuous. But for most, the afterlife was vague, a continuation without clear reward or punishment. What mattered more was the funeral, the ritual that ensured you did not become a wandering spirit, lemur, or a neglected ghost, larva. The deceased needed to be properly interred, remembered, and integrated into the world of the ancestors. This is why Roman tombs often lined the roads just outside the city walls. Burial within city limits was illegal, but just beyond the gates, the dead made their presence known. Tombs of every kind, simple markers, elaborate mausoleums, family vaults stretched along the Via Appia and other major routes. They were placed not to conceal the dead, but to display them. The tomb was an advertisement. Here lies Marcus, son of Marcus, who served as questor, built a bridge, and gave bread to the poor. Inscriptions were often formulaic, but detailed. Titles, virtues, and benefactions were immortalized in stone. Even freedmen, former slaves, proudly recorded their rise to status, their children, and their patrons. In this sense, Roman death was deeply civic. It was not about escaping the body, nor about individual judgment in a metaphysical realm. It was about fame. To die well was to be remembered well. To be remembered was to live on not in a paradise, but in the memory of Rome itself. And yet, among these public performances of legacy, something quieter stirred. The poets, especially in the late Republic and early Empire, began to question these rituals. Lucretius, writing in the 1st century BCE, argued in De Rerum Natura that death was nothing. When we are, death is not. And when death is, we are not. For him, belief in an afterlife was a product of fear, and funerals were consolations for the living, not maps for the dead. Others, like Virgil, took a different route. In Book VI of the Aeneid, Virgil offers perhaps the most famous Roman vision of the afterlife. Aeneas descends into the underworld, guided by the Sibyl, and sees both torments and rewards. The underworld is carefully organized: Tartarus for the wicked, Elysium for the just. In Elysium, he finds his father Anchises, who teaches him the soul's cycle of reincarnation and the destiny of Rome. This scene had enormous influence not just in Rome, but later in Christian and medieval visions of the afterlife. It gave moral texture to Roman death. For the first time in Roman literature, the afterlife becomes a place of judgment, not just shadow. Anchises describes souls being purified, preparing to return to life. This is not Sheol's silence, but a moral universe. Still, it's unclear how literally this was believed. Virgil's version of the underworld was poetic, not theological, and most Romans, especially in the Republican period, continued to approach death pragmatically. Rituals mattered, beliefs less so. The Roman calendar was filled with festivals of the dead. The Parentalia, February 1321, when families visited tombs to honor ancestors with offerings. The Lemuria, May 9, 11, and 13, when malevolent spirits were exorcised from the home by tossing black beans and reciting incantations. These rites were not private affairs, they were civic obligations. The dead were part of the community; neglecting them invited misfortune. Even emperors participated. Augustus, in consolidating his power, emphasized his descent from the divine Julius Caesar, declared a god after death. The imperial cult blurred the line between religion and politics, between memory and divinity. Death became a pathway to deification, at least for those powerful enough to afford it. In this world, the Elysian fields remained a distant ideal. They were for heroes Romulus, Aeneas, Scipio. For most Romans, the best afterlife was a well-kept tomb, a dutiful family, and a name remembered. And yet, this focus on legacy raises questions. What of those without descendants? The poor, the enslaved, the forgotten? Could they hope for anything beyond silence? We begin to see in the funerary epitaphs of common people a different tone. Some are defiant. "I was not, I was, I am not, I care not," reads one. Others plead for remembrance, however small. "Stranger, do not pass by my tomb without saying my name." And in those words, we hear something ancient and universal. Not a belief in paradise, nor fear of torment, but a longing not to be erased. So what truly did the Romans believe about death? Perhaps the better question is, what did they fear about being forgotten? If the Roman elite poured their wealth and civic pride into funerals and monuments, then the everyday practice of Roman death was more subtle but no less structured. In many ways, the afterlife for ordinary Romans was experienced in the world of the living, not through metaphysical journeys or divine judgment, but through continued care or the lack of it. Let us descend from the marble tombs of the Appian Way and walk into the crowded columbaria underground, honeycombed walls filled with niches for urns. These communal burial sites were often sponsored by funerary guilds, especially popular among freedmen and tradespeople. Members paid modest dues during their lives, and in return were promised a proper burial, a nameplate, perhaps even a short inscription. It was a practical solution to a theological problem: how to ensure your soul was not lost in neglect. These burial clubs were not just financial arrangements. They were networks of memory insurance. If your family failed you, or if you had no family, your collegium would keep your name alive. The Roman afterlife did not demand piety. It demanded presence, names spoken, tombs tended, offerings made. A forgotten grave was a spiritual risk. In some tombs, especially from the 1st century BCE onward, inscriptions even included contracts, explicit legal texts requiring heirs to perform specific rites. To my son, I leave this tomb, with the condition that he offer wine on my birthday and pour milk during the parentalia. Failure to perform these duties could, at least in theory, result in legal consequences or social shame. It is tempting to see these demands as manipulative, but they were rooted in deep cultural belief. The dead were not gone, they were watching. Roman ghosts or manes were not necessarily frightening. They could be protective, but if forgotten, mistreated, or improperly buried, they could become restless lemures, malevolent spirits that wandered the earth, haunting the living until appeased. This belief fed the Lemuria, an annual rite of ghostly negotiation. During Lemuria, Roman households conducted nocturnal rituals to drive away any vengeful shades. The paterfamilias would walk barefoot, tossing black beans over his shoulder while chanting incantations 9 times. "With these I redeem me and mine," he would say, casting the beans as offerings for the unknown dead. It was a curious fusion of practical superstition and ancestral reverence. The boundaries between the honored and the forgotten were porous. Anyone could become a ghost not through sin, but through neglect. Even the rich hedged their bets. Tombs often included libation tubes, small channels through which wine, milk, or oil could be poured directly into the grave. Whether the soul consumed these gifts metaphorically or literally, no one dared leave it thirsty. And then there were the epitaphs. More than mere gravestones, Roman epitaphs were messages to the living, sometimes stern, sometimes tender, often surprisingly modern. A wife might write of her husband, "He lived 40 years, he was a good man. Let no one speak ill of him." A father might beg strangers, "Walk slowly by my tomb, traveler, and say my name. I ask no more." In these lines, we see a theology not of divine reward but of human continuity. To die was to pass into the realm of shadows. To be remembered was to remain among the community. To be forgotten was to die a second time. And yet, while the popular imagination remained focused on earthly remembrance, philosophical circles began entertaining more abstract notions of the soul. Stoicism, widely influential in elite Roman society, taught that the soul, like the body, was made of material substance and would dissolve back into the cosmos. There was no individual immortality, no reward or punishment, only the return to the natural order. For Stoics, virtue lay in living well, not in posthumous existence. Epicureans like Lucretius went further. They denied any afterlife outright. The soul died with the body. Fear of death was irrational. "Death is nothing to us," Lucretius wrote, "for when we are, death is not, and when death is, we are not." Such beliefs liberated the individual from anxiety, but they also stripped funerary rituals of metaphysical meaning. Still, these philosophical views never fully displaced traditional practices. Most Romans, even the educated, continued to honor the dead ritually, just in case. As Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and imperial advisor, once noted with dry wit, "We do not believe in the shades below, but we offer them cakes and wine." For the common people, belief remained rooted in ancestral presence. The household gods, the Lares and Penates, represented familial spirits. Little shrines in Roman homes kept these spirits close. Meals began with libations to them. The dead were not gone. They were housemates, invisible but near. But what of the virtuous? Did they expect something more? The idea of the Elysian Fields, a paradisiacal realm for heroes, had long been part of Roman poetic tradition. Adapted from Greek myth, Elysium was a land of eternal spring, song, and light. But it was a selective afterlife, reserved for exceptional souls. Aeneas visits it in the Aeneid and sees warriors, poets, and statesmen enjoying peace. Anchises tells him that souls come there briefly before being reincarnated. few Romans expected to reach Elysium. It was not offered to the pious but to the glorious. Virtue in this context was not moral but public. Those who served the Republic through conquest, politics, or civic virtue might hope for a place among the immortals. But for the average baker, mason, or merchant, the tomb was their heaven. Interestingly, some tomb inscriptions play with this exclusivity. If virtue leads to Elysium, one freedwoman writes, then let me in. In these rare lines, we hear not only hope but argument, an assertion that decency, not birth or fame, should determine one's fate. By the time of the early empire, these currents, ritual devotion, civic immortality, poetic paradise, philosophical denial, coexisted. Roman religion was never doctrinaire. It was, above all, practical. As long as the rites were done and the name remembered, the rest was flexible. But beneath the pragmatism, an unease remained. Romans feared oblivion, not hellfire. They feared dying nameless, childless, unburied. The worst fates were to die in exile, to be lost at sea, to be consumed by animals' deaths that precluded burial and thus memory. Cicero, speaking of his own grief at his daughter's death, writes not of heaven but of the pain of absence. He does not know where she is, but he knows she is gone, and that is enough to break him. Still, we must ask, did the Romans truly believe the dead lived on? Or did they build tombs, write epitaphs, and conduct rites not for the dead, but for themselves? And if so, what happens to the dead once the living no longer remember? In the final analysis of Roman death, we must return to the central tension that ran like a thread through all levels of Roman society, the tension between remembering and forgetting. While religious doctrines and poetic visions played a role in shaping Roman afterlife expectations, the practical rituals of the Roman world were rooted in a much more terrestrial belief. To be remembered was to live on, and to be forgotten was to die a second time. The poet Horace, writing during the transition from republic to empire, captured this sentiment succinctly. Non omnis morior, I shall not wholly die. In the same poem, he boasts that his poetry has built a monument more lasting than bronze. This was not idle metaphor. Horace understood what the funerary epitaphs, mausoleums, processions, and cults of ancestors had always implied. Legacy was everything. Tombs were made not to comfort the soul, but to assert the enduring presence of the dead in the world of the living. But time is cruel even to stone. The grandeur of the Via Appia, once lined with ornate tombs and statuary, is today a ruin-strewn road. The names are worn away. The libation tubes are dry. The columbaria are silent. So what happens to a culture whose immortality depends on memory when memory inevitably fades? The Roman elite knew this problem well. That's why they hedged their bets through multiple modes of remembrance. A wealthy senator might build a mausoleum, fund a public bath, commission a statue, and write a self-praising epitaph. A freedman might join a burial club, raise a tomb for his family, and leave instructions for annual offerings. Even the humblest Roman might scratch his name onto a marker, asking passers-by to say it aloud. But even this was not enough. In the imperial period, emperors themselves took steps to institutionalize immortality. The imperial cult gave official, even divine, status to dead rulers. Temples to deified emperors were built across the empire from Gaul to Syria. Coins bore their images. Priests were appointed to conduct sacrifices. Augustus became Divus Augustus, the divine Augustus, ensuring that his memory was not just familial but national. And yet, even here, immortality was political. It could be revoked. When an emperor was damned by the Senate, a process known as damnatio memoriae, his name and image were systematically erased. Statues defaced, inscriptions scratched out, documents destroyed. His memory was condemned not just legally but spiritually. This form of posthumous punishment was feared more than death. It was, in a way, a Roman hell, not one of fire but one of total erasure. The power of this punishment lay not in belief about the soul, but in the Roman conviction that to be remembered was to continue existing and to be erased was to be nothing. The soul's metaphysical state remained unclear, but the social soul, its name, its deeds, its image could be annihilated. This brings us back to the Elysian fields, that fabled Roman paradise drawn from Greek tradition. As we saw in Virgil's Aeneid, the Elysian fields were reserved for a few: heroes, poets, statesmen, those who had lived not just well but gloriously. It was a green and sunny realm where the souls of the righteous walked in peace, played music, raced chariots, and awaited rebirth. But Elysium was never democratized. Unlike the Christian heaven that would come centuries later, it was not offered to everyone. There was no assurance that piety or kindness would gain you entry. Only greatness qualified, and greatness was judged by Rome, not by the gods. This elitism was reflected in Roman funerary art. Sarcophagi and tomb paintings from the later empire depict scenes not of paradise, but of daily life glorified banquets, marriages, hunts, civic duties. The afterlife, for many, was imagined not as a supernatural realm, but as an idealized continuation of this one. And yet, as Christianity began to spread throughout the empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, this worldview began to shift. Christian martyrs promised a new kind of memory, one secured not by civic virtue, but by faith. The tombs of martyrs and saints became centers of veneration, catacombs filled with symbols of resurrection, not lineage. The body was no longer a shadow in Hades, but a seed awaiting renewal. This spiritual revolution would eventually overtake Rome itself. By the 4th century, Emperor Constantine would legalize Christianity, and by the end of the century it would become the state religion. The afterlife of the Roman afterlife was beginning. Elysium faded, Hades became hell, and the cross replaced the imagines of ancestors. But the Roman obsession with memory endured. Christianity did not abandon the tomb. It baptized it. Churches were built over the graves of saints. Feast days commemorated the dead. Prayers were offered for souls in purgatory. The concept of being remembered, spoken aloud in liturgy, remained central. So in a way, Sheol's silence, the Egyptians' coffin spells, and Rome's funeral processions all fed into the same river, the longing not to vanish. Whether by virtue, ritual, lineage, or faith, cultures across time have sought to ensure that the dead are not forgotten. In modern Rome, tourists walk past ruined tombs with cameras in hand. They read Latin inscriptions they do not understand. They take pictures, post them, speak names aloud, unknowingly continuing ancient rituals. Somewhere along the Appian Way, an old stone reads, "If you read this, stranger, I still live." And in that moment, perhaps, the Roman soul endures. But we must ask, if remembrance is what grants immortality, and forgetting is inevitable, then what is the true cost of a life unlived in glory? Story 5. From catacombs to cathedrals, early Christian burial in a pagan world. The city of Rome is known for its monumental arches, triumphal roads, and imperial temples, but beneath its foundations lies another city, hidden in darkness, carved by faith: the catacombs. In these long, narrow tunnels, early Christians laid their dead to rest, not in grand marble sarcophagi nor in roadside tombs, but in silence and in stone, beneath the earth, hidden from the world above. To walk through the catacombs today is to enter not just a burial ground but a theological statement. For early Christians, death was not an end, nor a descent into shadow, nor an uncertain crossing. It was a beginning, the seed of resurrection, the imitation of Christ's own death and rising. But this conviction developed slowly, against the grain of the Roman world, where death was both theatrical and civic, and where the afterlife remained elusive or elite. In the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, Christianity was still a fragile, persecuted faith. Its followers were often accused of atheism, for denying the Roman gods, of cannibalism, a misunderstanding of the Eucharist, and of subversion, for refusing to offer incense to the emperor. In this world of suspicion and danger, burial became both a necessity and an opportunity, a way to preserve identity, to care for the body, and to express belief without uttering a word. The Roman world offered several burial options. Cremation was common, especially among the upper classes, though inhumation, burial of the body, began gaining popularity in the 2nd century CE. Christians, however, almost uniformly practiced inhumation, modeling their approach on the death and burial of Jesus. The body was laid in a niche loculus, often wrapped in linen, and sealed with a slab of marble or tile. These catacombs were not dug in secrecy, as is often romantically imagined, but were part of the Roman legal framework for burial grounds. They were often located on land owned by Christian families or congregations. The Catacomb of Calixtus, one of the largest, was established in the mid-2nd century and eventually held the remains of several early popes. Yet while these spaces were legal, they were liminal, neither truly Roman nor fully Christian, neither public nor entirely private. And that made them the perfect canvas for a new vision of death and the afterlife. The walls of the catacombs are not filled with scenes of judgment or torture. There are no tormented souls, no divine punishments. Instead, we find images of rest and hope. The Good Shepherd, carrying a sheep on his shoulders, evoking both Psalm 23 and Jesus' parable. Jonah and the great fish, symbolizing rescue from death and rebirth. A banquet table, suggestive of the heavenly feast to come. A boat on calm waters, a dove with an olive branch or a vine stretching across the wall. These are symbols, not sermons. They whisper of resurrection but do not explain it. The early Christian imagination, still forming, was not yet systematized. There was no formal doctrine of purgatory or the beatific vision. What existed was trust that as Christ had risen, so too would his followers. Not immediately, perhaps, but eventually. In carne, in spiritu, in gloria, in flesh, in spirit, in glory. Interestingly, these tombs were rarely individualistic. Family tombs existed, but more often catacombs were communal. The Christian identity was one of the body, the ecclesia, not the isolated soul. To be buried among the faithful was to remain part of the church, even in death. The living would visit these sites during feasts, bring oil lamps, pray, sing psalms, and sometimes even share a small meal near the grave of a martyr or loved one. This communal emphasis also reflected early Christian egalitarianism in death. In the catacombs, bishops were buried near tradesmen, children near widows, freed slaves near teachers. Tomb inscriptions, when present, were often brief and heartfelt. To my sweet daughter who sleeps in peace. Victor, faithful in Christ. Here lies Petronia, servant of God, who awaits the resurrection. Names were preserved, not to boast of status, but to affirm identity within the Christian story. The goal was not fame, but fidelity. And yet, the catacombs were not immune to influence from the pagan world above. As Christian communities grew in wealth and visibility, elements of Roman funerary art began to appear in their tombs. Some sarcophagi borrowed classical motifs, cupids, vines, peacocks, or figures reclining at feasts. These were not pagan imports so much as recontextualizations, art repurposed to point toward Christian themes of eternal life, peace, and triumph over death. The result is a fascinating blend of cultural continuity and spiritual contrast. Where Roman tombs focused on civic identity, Christian tombs spoke of spiritual belonging. Where Roman epitaphs detailed careers and virtues, Christian inscriptions simply confessed hope. Where Roman religion often left the afterlife ambiguous or exclusive, Christianity made a radical claim. Resurrection was for all, slave and senator, woman and child, poor and rich. But belief alone did not make death easy. Christians still grieved. Plague, persecution, and poverty left many cemeteries overcrowded. Children died in staggering numbers. Families mourned deeply. Some tombs include the Latin word veil, farewell, etched with trembling fingers. The hope of resurrection did not remove the pain of separation. What it did do, however, was change the meaning of waiting. In Christian catacombs, the dead were not trapped in a shadow realm like Sheol, nor sleeping in neutral forgetfulness like the Roman manes. They were waiting in Christ. Their rest was a sleep, not an annihilation. Their tombs were not prisons, but gardens in waiting, where the seeds of the body would be raised at the appointed time. Even so, questions remained. How long would the dead wait? Would they rise with the same bodies or new ones? What happened to martyrs versus ordinary believers? Was the soul conscious in the interim? These theological questions would be taken up in later centuries by church fathers like Tertullian, Augustine, and Origen. But in the early catacombs, the answers were less important than the presence of faith. A dove painted on a low ceiling, a shepherd etched beside a name, a slab marked in pace in peace. These spoke not of systematized theology, but of trust. A trust that death had been defeated not by argument, but by example by Jesus, who died, was buried, and rose again. Still, we might wonder, how did these simple subterranean burials evolve into soaring cathedrals, gilded reliquaries, and elaborate cults of saints? As Christianity emerged from the margins of the Roman Empire into its very center, the way it treated the dead and thought about death underwent a quiet but profound transformation. What began as humble burials in catacombs under Roman streets evolved, across the 3rd and 4th centuries, into a new theology of space, memory, and presence. The dead were no longer just waiting, they were interceding. At the center of this transformation was a new figure, the martyr. Martyrs, those who died for their faith under Roman persecution, quickly came to occupy a special place in Christian imagination. Their deaths were seen not as defeats, but as victories, reenactments of Christ's passion, proof of unshakable faith. While all Christians hoped for resurrection, martyrs were thought to have secured it their blood a direct path to glory. In the early centuries, Christians began to gather at the tombs of martyrs, particularly on the anniversaries of their deaths. These were not quiet vigils. They were liturgical celebrations marked with hymns, readings, prayers, and even feasting. Augustine, writing centuries later, criticized some gatherings for veering into revelry. It is better to honor the martyrs by imitating them than by drinking over their graves. Yet these gatherings spoke to something deeper, a belief that martyrs were not merely dead, but present, not passive in Sheol, but active in heaven. Their tombs became focal points of prayer, places where heaven and earth touched. This laid the groundwork for the cult of the saints, a movement that would reshape Christian theology, art, and architecture. By the late 3rd century, especially after Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 CE legalized Christianity, the shift accelerated. No longer forced to worship underground, Christians began constructing churches above the tombs of saints. The most famous example is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, built on what was believed to be the site of Peter's martyrdom and burial. Constantine himself ordered the construction of a large basilica atop the hill, requiring a massive leveling project to accommodate the structure. The altar was placed directly over the apostles' presumed grave. It wasn't just architectural, it was theological. The church grew out of the tomb. This model would be repeated across the Christian world. In Milan, St. Ambrose built basilicas over the remains of local martyrs. In Carthage, shrines were raised to St. Cyprian. In Gaul, relics of saints were distributed and installed in altars. Even remote towns competed to claim a holy body, an arm, a bone, a vial of blood, so they too might benefit from the saint's proximity. The relic, once the decaying body of the dead, was now a conduit of divine power. This was a major shift from both Roman and Jewish funerary traditions. In Judaism, contact with the dead was ritually impure. In Roman religion, the tomb was the final resting place, not a power source. But in Christianity, the grave became a threshold, a place where the miraculous might erupt. Stories began to circulate of healings at tombs, visions near shrines, and answered prayers through saintly intercession. People traveled hundreds of miles to visit the bones of Stephen, the first martyr, to kneel at the crypt of Agnes, to anoint themselves with oil that had touched the bones of Lawrence. In time, the practice of translation, moving a saint's relics from one place to another, emerged. This was not merely transport, it was theological choreography. Relics were carried in solemn procession, accompanied by chants, incense, and ceremony. Cities vied for possession of powerful remains. A saint could bring prestige, pilgrims, and divine protection. Even the architectural language evolved. The earliest churches often included a crypt beneath the main altar, allowing pilgrims to descend and pray close to the saint. In some basilicas, the floor included fenestelli, small openings in the altar that allowed cloths, offerings, or prayers to be lowered into the tomb below. This physical closeness to the dead was seen as spiritually potent. But not all Christians were comfortable with this evolution. Figures like Athanasius of Alexandria and Augustine of Hippo worried that the veneration of relics might slip into superstition. They emphasized that saints were not gods, but servants of God. Prayer was to be directed through them, not to them. The power lay not in the bones themselves, but in the God who honored their witness. Still, for the average believer, the lines were not always so clear. By the 5th century, tomb inscriptions had changed. They no longer just commemorated the dead, they invoked them. Holy martyr, pray for me. Blessed Lawrence, protect my son. Saints Cosmas and Damian, heal my affliction. The dead had become advocates not in court, but in heaven. Just as Roman clients once petitioned their patrons for aid, now Christians turned to saints as heavenly patrons. This spiritual network reshaped not only theology, but social relationships. Burial near a saint became highly desirable. Wealthy families donated land or built chapels in hopes of proximity to a martyr's tomb. Bishops were often buried within the church, near the altar, reinforcing their spiritual and administrative authority. Even the design of tombs changed. Where once catacomb niches were sealed and anonymous, new Christian sarcophagi were ornate, filled with biblical scenes. Daniel in the lion's den, Jonah being swallowed and returned, the raising of Lazarus. These were not just illustrations, they were arguments, visual claims about resurrection and salvation. And yet, for all this growth and grandeur, the core remained the same. Death was not the end. The tomb was not abandonment. The body, though decaying, was sacred, and memory was not only personal but communal. What began in the dark catacombs as whispered hope had become stone and sanctuary. Saints were no longer buried in secret. They were enthroned beneath altars, within chapels, and in the hearts of believers who saw in them a bridge between earth and eternity. But this raises a question. If every saint is a bridge, what happens when the dead no longer intercede, when their names fade, their shrines crumble, and their relics are lost? As Christianity spread across the Mediterranean and beyond, so too did its funerary culture evolve from hidden graves beneath the earth to ornate tombs beneath church altars. But beneath the grand basilicas and the richly adorned reliquaries remained a persistent question, unchanged since the days of the catacombs. What truly happens to the body after death? In this final section, we consider how early Christian beliefs about the resurrection of the body, once vague and symbolic, hardened into doctrine, ritual, and ecclesiastical control. We also examine what became of those humble spaces of early burial, and what they say about how a religion reimagined death not just theologically, but institutionally. The body in waiting, resurrection, and the end of time. One of Christianity's most distinctive teachings then and now is the belief in a bodily resurrection. But in the first centuries, this idea was more mystery than mechanism. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, wrote of the dead being raised imperishable, and of the corruptible putting on incorruptibility. Yet he offered no anatomical explanation, no step-by-step account of how bones and flesh might be restored. For early Christians, this ambiguity was both comforting and complicated. They believed resurrection would occur at the end of time, at the last judgment when Christ returned and the dead were raised. But what of the interim? Was the soul conscious? Did it rest, wander, wait? Theologians grappled with these questions for centuries. Tertullian believed the soul retained some form of awareness, even taste and touch. Origen, more mystical, suggested a spiritual body that transcended flesh. Augustine vacillated, ultimately affirming both the soul's conscious experience and the eventual resurrection of the physical body, restored and perfected. But even as doctrine was debated, ritual practice often answered in silence. Christians continued to bury their dead with care facing east, symbolizing the coming dawn, with inscriptions that invoked peace and rest, and with symbols that reminded the living of divine promise. Graves were not just memories, but places of anticipation. They held not only remains, but expectation. This belief in resurrection also had a surprisingly practical effect. It shaped how bodies were treated. Unlike pagan Roman cremation, which destroyed the body, Christian inhumation preserved it for the future. This was not superstition, but theology. The body, like a seed, was to be planted awaiting the harvest. Memory, martyrology, and the politics of the dead. As centuries passed, a new anxiety emerged, not about death, but about memory. In a rapidly expanding and diversifying church, how could one ensure the proper commemoration of the faithful departed? The solution was liturgical commemoration. Church calendars began to include dies natales, the birthdays of saints, marking the day they died, and were believed to be born into eternal life. The names of martyrs and bishops were read aloud during Eucharistic prayers. The Martyrologium Hieronymianum, compiled in the 5th century, attempted to catalog saints and their feast days across the Christian world. These efforts were not only devotional, they were administrative. The Church was becoming the guardian of memory, the curator of the sacred dead. To forget a saint was not merely a personal loss, but a theological failure. If the dead were praying for the living must pray and remember the dead. This memory extended even to ordinary believers. The practice of offering masses for the dead, especially on the anniversary of death, became widespread. It was believed that such prayers could aid the soul's passage through purgation, even if the body lay still. In time, this would blossom into the full medieval doctrine of purgatory, but in the early centuries, it remained a more relational act than metaphysical theory. Still, not every body could be remembered. The sheer volume of the dead, the limits of institutional memory, and the fragility of stone meant that many tombs faded into silence. Catacombs were eventually abandoned, sealed, and forgotten, until rediscovered by archaeologists centuries later. Yet the Church found ways to symbolically maintain presence. The Feast of All Saints and All Souls, emerging in the 8th and 10th centuries, became a liturgical recognition of all the dead, not just the famous or fortunate. It was an admission of forgetfulness, made holy. From graves to glory, architecture, authority, and afterlife. By the time of Charlemagne in the 9th century, the Christian treatment of death had changed dramatically. The catacombs were closed, churches had taken their place. The underground hope of the persecuted church was now enshrined in gilded altars and marble chapels. This architectural shift was not just aesthetic. It reflected a centralization of religious authority. Where early Christians buried their dead communally and simply, the medieval church began regulating burial privileges. Being interred near the altar, a practice that began with saints and bishops, was now extended to nobility and patrons, but at a cost. Graves were no longer just theological, they were transactional. Pilgrimage churches competed for relics. Abbeys charged for burials in sacred ground. Masses for the dead could be endowed indefinitely. A spiritual economy had developed, shaped by a deep belief in the afterlife and a growing fear of its uncertainties. But the seeds of this system lay in the early centuries, in the tension between hope and hierarchy, between a faith that promised resurrection for all, and a society that still privileged the powerful. Yet for all this, the humble tombs of the catacombs remained a quiet witness. Rediscovered in the 16th and 19th centuries, these underground burial networks revealed not just bones, but belief. Simple inscriptions, faded frescoes, broken oil lamps all testified to a community that buried its dead with reverence, that faced death with faith, and that carved into stone its quiet hope. Dormit in pace, she sleeps in peace. Expectat resurrectionem, he awaits the resurrection. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson. While doctrines changed, empires fell and basilicas rose, the Christian treatment of death remained anchored in a paradox, that to die was to wait, and to wait was to trust not in memory alone, nor in relics or ritual, but in the mystery of life beyond death. So now we might ask, if death was once a whisper in the catacombs, and then a chant in the cathedral, what then is it today? Story 6. Celtic tombs and Druidic silence, death before Christianity in the British Isles. Before the bells of Christian monasteries rang through the green hills of Ireland, and the stone churches of Anglo-Saxon England rose from the soil, the people of the British Isles had their own way of confronting death. They did so with stone, with ritual, and with silence, not the silence of forgetting, but a sacred, humming stillness in which the world of the living and the world of the dead overlapped. To understand Celtic mortuary beliefs before Christianity, we must cast our gaze back not merely centuries but millennia into a time without written records, where ritual landscapes and burial monuments remain as the primary voices of the past. These were societies without centralized states or urban centers, where identity was often local, kin-based, and oral. But death, as ever, imposed a kind of order. The earliest Neolithic monuments of the British Isles passage tombs, long barrows and cairns are more than mere graves. They are places of alignment, commemoration, and perhaps even transformation. Consider Newgrange, built around 3200 BCE in Ireland. From the outside, it appears as a grassy mound topped with white quartz and ringed with curbstones, many intricately carved. Inside, a narrow stone passage leads to a central chamber beneath a corbelled dome. Every year during the winter solstice, a shaft of light enters through a perfectly aligned roof box and illuminates the inner sanctum. Was this a calendar, a religious symbol, a metaphor for rebirth? We do not know, but what is clear is this: the dead were not forgotten. They were interred at the heart of these structures, in cremated fragments or intact bodies, placed with care alongside beads, bones, pottery, and tools. These tombs were not private but public, ceremonial. They suggest a worldview in which the dead remained among the living, embedded in the land itself. Similar patterns emerge across the islands. Micho and Orkney, its passageway aligned with the setting winter sun. Knowth and Douth, companions to Newgrange, filled with megalithic art and multiple burial chambers. West Kennet Long Barrow in southern England, holding dozens of individuals over centuries. In these early societies, there is no clear distinction between religion and life, between sacred and secular. The burial sites often exist in ritual landscapes near stone circles, henges, or natural features like rivers and hills. They are part of a cosmology in which ancestry, land, and identity are inextricably linked. But what of the Druids, those elusive priestly figures of later Celtic societies? Julius Caesar, writing in the 1st century BCE, gives us the most detailed though certainly biased account of the Druids. He claims they oversaw religious life among the Gauls and Britons, presided over sacrifices, including humans, controversially, and believed in the immortality of the soul. According to Caesar, the Druids taught that the soul passed into another body after death, suggesting a form of transmigration or reincarnation. Is this accurate? possibly though Caesar may have exaggerated to frame his enemies as exotic or dangerous. Still, Irish and Welsh mythological texts from later periods contain echoes of such beliefs. In the Tales of Taliesin and the Mabinogion, characters are often reborn, transformed, or shift between worlds. These are not linear tales of life and afterlife, but cyclical, shape-shifting narratives. Death in these stories is not an ending, it is a portal. Archaeological evidence supports this complexity. In many Iron Age burials, we find selective deposition of remains. Skulls buried without bodies, bodies without heads, cremations alongside inhumations. Some graves include animal bones, weapons, or feasting gear. Others are strangely austere. There is no standardization, no uniform theology. Instead, what emerges is a diversity of practices, often regionally specific, reflecting both spiritual and social dimensions. Elite individuals might be buried in chariots, such as the famous burial at Wetwang Slack in Yorkshire, or with torques, mirrors, and imported goods. These were not only signs of status, they may have marked the deceased as ritual specialists, warriors, or community leaders. Their burial rites suggest a belief that the dead retained power to bless, to guide, or to haunt. Perhaps most intriguingly, some bodies were deposited in bogs, where the unique anaerobic conditions preserved skin, hair, and even stomach contents. The so-called bog bodies of Ireland and Britain, like Clonacavin Man or Lindo Man, suggest ritual killings. They were often bound, struck, and placed with offerings, perhaps as sacrifices to the gods or as offerings to the land itself. These are not ordinary burials. They speak of a world charged with spiritual energy, where death could be a form of communication with powers beyond the visible. And yet, there is a kind of respectful silence in much of this. Unlike the classical Mediterranean, with its elaborate funerary inscriptions and detailed mythologies of the underworld, the pre-Christian Britons left no grand tomb biographies, no written visions of life beyond death. Their voices, if we hear them at all, speak through stone, soil, and ritual. This silence is not absence. It may reflect a different understanding of the sacred one that eschews dogma in favor of experience, mystery, and seasonal rhythm. But what happened when this ancient worldview met the rising tide of Christianity? How did monks and missionaries respond to burial mounds that predated Abraham, to hill forts that housed ancestral spirits, to sacred groves where druids once stood in silence? And what became of the dead who were not Christian? In the centuries following the Roman conquest of Britain in 43 CE, and especially after the arrival of Christian missionaries in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the ancient funerary customs of the British Isles began to shift not abruptly, but through a quiet collision of worldviews. It was a transformation carried not by sword or edict alone, but by the slow sedimentation of ritual change, memory loss, and theological reframing. The pre-Christian world of the Celts had been rich with diversity: cairns, bog burials, cremations, elite chariot graves, sacred groves. But with the spread of Christianity came a new kind of burial practice, a new vocabulary of the dead, and a new anxiety over the meaning of pagan graves. This section explores how those two systems, Druidic and Christian, indigenous and imported, coexisted, clashed, and finally melded into the unique Christian mortuary landscape of early medieval Britain and Ireland. And how, despite the missionary zeal of Rome and Iona, many of the old beliefs refused to die quietly. 1. Missionaries' memory and the remapping of sacred space. By the early 5th century, Christianity had arrived in the western reaches of the Roman Empire. In Roman Britain, Christian communities had likely existed from the late 3rd century, evidenced by archaeological finds such as the Cairo monogram at the Hinton St. Mary mosaic and burial inscriptions in Latin bearing Christian symbols. But Christianity's reach into non-Roman Britain, into the wilder Celtic regions of Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and the Western Isles, was much slower and more complex. There was no single moment of conversion. Rather, It occurred as a gradual negotiation, often through elite sponsorship, monastic settlement, and crucially through the reinterpretation of space. Christian missionaries did not simply build new churches, they often repurposed existing sacred sites. Old burial mounds became sites for hermitages or chapels. Stone circles were left intact or Christianized with crosses. Wells and groves associated with pagan rites were rededicated to Christian saints. This wasn't always a matter of conquest. In many cases, it was a strategic continuity, a way of smoothing the transition from old to new, of making Christianity feel less foreign. Consider the many Irish and Welsh saints whose hagiographies describe them building churches on ancient sites, taming spirits, or converting local chieftains through signs and wonders. St. Patrick is said to have confronted Druids at Tara, the seat of Irish kings, but the conflict is framed as spiritual and symbolic rather than physical. His famous letter to Coroticus condemns the mistreatment of newly baptized Christians, but even in his own writings, the presence of paganism is not yet fully banished. These missionaries, educated and literate, also introduced cemetery organization. Graves began to be aligned east-west, reflecting belief in the resurrection. Grave goods, common in pagan burials, were discouraged or forbidden. The body was increasingly seen as a sleeping vessel, awaiting the last judgment. Yet many older practices persisted. Two pagan echoes in Christian soil. Despite the rise of formal Christian burial, archaeologists continue to find burials from the 5th–7th centuries that reflect a hybrid approach, suggesting a period of coexistence between pagan and Christian rituals. In some parts of Britain and Ireland, grave goods such as brooches, weapons, or drinking vessels were still included. Barrow burials were maintained, even revived, particularly for high-status individuals. Bog burials continued sporadically into the early medieval period, though with increasing Christian reinterpretation. Some of the earliest monastic cemeteries, such as at Clonmacnoise in Ireland or Whitthorne in Scotland, were established on or near sites already associated with pre-Christian sanctity. These new cemeteries often retained a sense of ancestral depth. Even the architecture of early Christian cemeteries showed compromise. Circular enclosures, a likely holdover from Iron Age ritual sites, standing stones, and carved crosses with pagan motifs such as spirals, knots, and animal forms. The Ogham stones of early medieval Ireland, inscribed with an ancient script and names of the dead, also suggest continuity. Some were later reused in Christian contexts, but their linguistic and symbolic roots are pre-Christian. The stone did not forget, even when the words were no longer understood. Monastic scribes, too, preserved elements of pre-Christian thought. Irish monks recorded mythological cycles and heroic tales that included transformations, otherworld journeys, and shape-shifting remnants of an earlier theology of death and spirit. The Christianization of these stories did not fully erase their earlier meanings. Three saints, spirits, and the dead that would not stay silent. Perhaps the clearest sign of enduring belief in non-Christian death lore is the widespread concern with restless spirits, a fear that the dead, if not properly honored, would return. Even as Christian theology insisted on heaven, hell, and resurrection, local folklore in Ireland, Wales, and northern Britain retained the idea of the otherworld not a place of punishment or reward, but a parallel realm where the dead could dwell, feast, or even interfere in human affairs. Christian saints became the new intercessors with this realm. Stories abound of saints confronting ghosts or fairy hosts near burial mounds, clergy being summoned to bless graves that wouldn't stay shut, hermits building their cells near old barrows to subdue the spirits within. Even penitential literature guides for confessors contains remnants of older fears. Priests were instructed to ask whether someone had consulted the dead, or attempted to invoke spirits at graves, a clear sign that such practices persisted in the countryside, long after formal conversion. This tension between formal doctrine and popular belief persisted well into the Middle Ages. In some areas, ancestral veneration remained subtly woven into Christian practice. Candles lit for saints were also lit for long-dead kin. Pilgrimages to holy wells overlapped with older, seasonal rites. The veil between worlds, thin in Druidic belief, remained porous in folk Christianity. 4. The silence of the Druid. And what of the Druids themselves? By the 7th century, they had vanished from the historical record. Whether by suppression, adaptation, or quiet fatting, the Druidic class as a formal institution no longer functioned. Yet their legacy, shaped by centuries of Roman, Christian, and later Romantic interpretation, remained powerful. Early Christian writers in Ireland often portrayed Druids as foils to saints keepers of dangerous magic, false prophets, or stubborn resistors. But in doing so, they preserved the memory of a time when knowledge was oral, the seasons sacred, and burial an act of cosmic balance. Some scholars believe that the earliest monastic scholars were in fact the intellectual heirs of the Druids. They copied texts, kept calendars, studied the stars, and counseled kings. The robes may have changed. The faith certainly had, but the role remained. In the end, it was not a violent overthrow, but a transformation. Conclusion: burial as a borderland. The transition from Celtic mortuary beliefs to Christian burial practices was not a clean break, but a dialogue across generations. Graves were not just physical places, they were borderlands, where different worldviews met, argued, and merged. Ancient barrows became Christian chapels. Pagan stones became inscribed with crosses. Ghosts of the otherworld became part of Christian folklore. And through it all, the dead remain present in stories, in stone, in ritual. But this leaves us with a final question. If Christianization redefined how the dead were buried, what did it do to how they were remembered? And in that remembering, what echoes of the old ways of Druids, of tombs, of stone and silence still speak? By the dawn of the 2nd millennium CE, Christianity had fully established itself in the British Isles. Monastic foundations dotted the landscape, diocesan structures had replaced tribal leadership in many areas, and churchyards enclosed the dead in consecrated soil. Yet beneath the surface of this Christian order remained the faint outline of another world, a mortuary culture that had neither scripture nor sanctuary, but had endured for millennia through ritual, land, and memory. This final section examines what happened to the memory of the pagan dead after their world faded, and how despite Christianity's triumph, those who died before its arrival continued to haunt, inspire, and shape the religious imagination of the living. 1. Christianization of the landscape, conquest or continuity. When medieval chroniclers wrote of the saints who brought Christianity to Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, they often framed these figures as holy conquerors banishing demons from wells, destroying idols, or exorcising spirits from ancient groves. Yet archaeological and folkloric evidence suggests a more complex truth. Many of these demons were once ancestral spirits, and the sites they haunted were once sacred places of burial and remembrance. Early Christian leaders may have opposed certain pagan rituals, but they also recognized the enduring power of place. Churches were built near prehistoric burial mounds, not to erase them, but to absorb their sanctity. Saints were often said to have blessed or tamed local wells and hills, subtly Christianizing them. Old pathways between tombs, ritual sites, or tribal boundaries became processional routes, sometimes preserved in the form of Christian pilgrimages. In this way, Christianity mapped itself onto an older religious topography. Memory did not die, it was repurposed. In fact, many early churches in Britain and Ireland are located near megalithic tombs or Iron Age hill forts. Their placement is unlikely to be coincidence. These were already known to locals as places of power associated with ancestors, spirits, or gods. The church's response was often to reinterpret rather than destroy. Even linguistic memory persisted. Names of saints were sometimes attached to ancient features whose original meanings were lost. For example, Saint Michael is frequently associated with hilltops across Britain, a pattern that may reflect his appropriation of older, pre-Christian sky deities or spirit guardians. Thus, the Christian landscape became a palimpsest new sanctity written over old, but never entirely erasing it. 2. The silent majority, forgotten dead and the limits of memory. Despite this blending of worlds, the vast majority of those who died before Christianity, tens of thousands over millennia, left no names behind. Unlike the Christian dead, whose names appeared on crosses, whose anniversaries were entered into calendars, and whose prayers were offered in liturgy, the pagan dead had no liturgical remembrance. They lived on only in place names which often preserve the memory of a burial: barrow, cairn, lech, len. Oral tradition, where legends often attach to old tombs or stone circles. Archaeological remains, carefully studied but rarely fully understood. It is difficult to say what people in the Christian Middle Ages thought of the long-dead occupants of passage tombs or long barrows. Many likely believed them to be giants, fairies, or cursed kings. Others may have respected them as ancestors, even if their exact identities had been forgotten. This is where folklore becomes an essential guide. In stories recorded as late as the 19th century, ancient burial sites across the British Isles were associated with sleeping heroes who would one day return, fairy hosts who emerged from hills on certain nights, cursed kings buried with their treasure, witches bound to the earth until Judgment Day. These tales may seem fantastical, but they reveal something profound. The dead were never entirely absent. Even when their theology had been forgotten, their presence remained in the cultural imagination. And so, though Christian theology offered a linear vision of life, death, and resurrection, the folk memory of the Isles retained a circular, seasonal, and spatial understanding of death, one in which the dead remained here, in the land, not awaiting judgment, but woven into the earth itself. 3. Relics, bones, and the politics of sacred remains. In Christian Europe, the cult of the saints depended on bones, usually those of martyrs or missionaries. Relics were housed in reliquaries, displayed at altars, and credited with miracles. But in Britain and Ireland, the process of identifying such bones was complicated by the fact that pagan burial sites were still visible and often mistaken or reinterpreted as Christian tombs. Some megalithic tombs were retroactively claimed as saintly resting places. In the absence of written records, early medieval Christians occasionally declared that a given mound or tomb must hold the remains of a local holy person. This blurring of identity had two effects. It allowed the church to sacralize ancient spaces without fully understanding them. It enabled the dead to continue exercising spiritual influence, albeit under new names. But not all bones were welcomed. Church councils and penitentials sometimes warned against ancestor worship, consultation of spirits, or visiting tombs outside of Christian custom. These prohibitions suggest that older funerary practices persisted in secret, in rural areas, or in syncretic form. The dead, it seems, refused to be fully Christianized. 4. Festivals of the Dead, Samhain, All Saints, and cultural survival. Perhaps the clearest example of the Church absorbing pre-Christian mortuary culture is the calendar itself. The Celtic festival of Samhain, traditionally held around November 1st, marked the end of the harvest and the thinning of the veil between the living and the dead. It was a time when ancestral spirits were believed to return, when offerings were made, and when divination was practiced. As Christianity expanded, the Church instituted All Saints' Day on November 1st, followed by All Souls' Day on November 2nd, a time to remember the faithful departed. Scholars have long noted the overlap. This was not mere coincidence, it was strategy. By placing Christian festivals near existing ones, the Church offered an alternative to pagan rites without directly confronting them. Over time, elements of Samhain survived in folk customs, including bonfires, mumming, and eventually the Halloween traditions we know today. Theologically, the shift was significant. Pagan Samhain saw the dead as returning temporarily. Christian All Souls' Day remembered the dead as awaiting resurrection. But in practice, both involved ritual, memory, and community gathering. It was a compromise that allowed the older rhythms of death observance to continue, even as Christian theology reshaped their meaning. 5. The modern rediscovery, archaeology and the return of the pagan dead. From the 17th century onward, antiquarians began to investigate the burial mounds, stone circles, and barrows that dotted the British countryside. Initially seen as curiosities or remnants of biblical times, these structures were gradually recognized as prehistoric, predating Christianity by thousands of years. The 19th and 20th centuries brought systematic excavation, the development of archaeological methods, and a new respect for the pagan past. Scholars began to understand the complexity and diversity of prehistoric burial practices, and with that, a new kind of cultural memory was born. No longer framed as pagan superstition, these tombs became national heritage sites, subjects of academic study, sources of spiritual revival for neo-pagan and Druidic movements. In some cases, the bones of the long dead were disinterred, studied, and reburied, sometimes in Christian cemeteries, other times in reconstructed barrows. This modern resurrection of the pagan dead is not literal, but symbolic. It represents a renewed curiosity about the past, a recognition that Christian Britain was built atop a much older landscape, and that death, like memory, is never truly final. Final reflection: who owns the dead? As we stand in a field in Wales or beside a burial mound in Ireland, we might ask, whose ancestors are buried here? Whose prayers, if any, accompany them? What names were whispered over these bones, now silent for thousands of years? The answers are elusive. Christianity transformed death in Britain and Ireland, gave it structure, doctrine, and liturgy. But the old ways lingered, in stone, in soil, in story. The pagan dead, it seems, were never fully erased. They were absorbed, renamed, sometimes feared, often respected, and always remembered, even if no one could say their names. And so we leave the barrow with a final question. If forgetting is the death of death, and memory its afterlife, then perhaps the most sacred burial of all is the one that remains mysterious.